Paul Sykes achieved personal greatness by sparring some of the greatest fighters in the history of the game. World champions like Michael and Leon Spinks, a young George Foreman, who, by all accounts, beat the living shit out of him in the ring. Thomas Hearns was another, Joe Frazier, as we mentioned, and John Conte all traded leather with Paul. Then there's other well-known British champions such as Richard Dunn and Bunny Johnson and Billy Graham. Ricky Hatton's former coach and former professional boxer himself said this of his first meeting with Paul Sykes. So this is when he was boxing at the time. And he said, the very first time I met Sykes, he came down to my gym in Manchester to spar with Phil Martin. But for some reason, Phil didn't want to spar with Paul. Maybe Phil thought he was going to fight him one day. I don't know. But I wanted to spar everyone because that was the only part of the training I liked. So I volunteered in Phil's place. When I sparred with Sykes, he had just come out of prison again, but he was surprisingly good boxer for a big guy. He was fit, strong, and a clever and smart and traditional boxer. With me, smaller and lighter than Paul, I was a lot quicker, and it was easy for me to slip his shots. So it's just to show you guys that, Billy Graham knows his stuff and clearly says, Sykes was a good fighter. He was a good fighter. It was just he started late. Just the way life planned out for him. But life on the outside was just as short as his boxing career because he was sent back to prison for 5 years in 1981 for pointing a gun through a nightclub door at two bouncers. When Paul actually speaks of this moment in his documentary very briefly, he says, 2 doormen in a nightclub, I fighted them to death. He fails to mention that he was actually carrying a gun that night. And that was part of the reason why he went in prison.
Although the main reason for his return to prison was when he agreed to take a contract out on union official in Blackpool. Preston Crown Court told a local newspaper, printed, boxer was hit man, jailed for 5 years. Wakefield-born heavyweight boxer Paul Sykes was paid £1,000 at St Anne's, Lancashire, by a company director to act as a hitman to stifle the union activities of a shop steward, jailing Sykes for 5 years. Judge Norman Sellers told him that this country would not tolerate hitmen. At this point, Paul Sykes was not at the peak of his violence and terrorism of anyone that was unfortunate to cross his path. Jamie Boyle said that he spoke with one woman who told me that one hotel owner in Blackpool committed suicide because Sykes was harassing him so much. Now, during his 5-year stint, he was one horrible guy, one horrible bastard to the other inmates and the screws, who took their chances to knock Paul down a peg or two with some insults. Again, Jamie Boyle explains this in greater detail in his book, and he said, after speaking to several prison guards over the years, I know that many of them used to tease Sykes over this also. At times when Sykes was in the block, the screws that really hated him would stand outside his door and shout, John L. Gardner says good night, you cowardly bastard. Now, it wasn't only the screws that gave Paul a taste of his own medicine, but that came from only a few men that had the bollocks to stand up to him. Men such as Fred the Head Mills of Newcastle and Billingham's Alan Cowley. Fred the Head used to fight with Sykes every time they bumped into each other, and Alan headbutted Paul several times before he ever got a chance to defend himself. So it sounds like, obviously when he's in the inside, because he's got this reputation about him, it's always that cliche saying, isn't there? It's like there's always someone bigger and harder than you out there. And they said that in school. It was always a cliche in my school, like, there's always someone bigger than harder than the guy who's supposed to be the biggest and hardest in the school. And I kind of feel like that's possibly what it's like in prison. I mean, not that I've ever spent any time there, but I know people who have, and there's always someone bigger than harder than themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a bit like, who's the daddy, isn't it? And the crazy thing is he had these scuffles, but I mean, we'll go into what other people thought of him inside the prison. I mean, he's at the peak of his horribleness basically right now. He's left boxing, and he was, we mentioned it. He wanted to get fit. He although he had a like to drink and he went out of the fight, he always wanted to stay quite fit. And he see the body as a temple. Now he's drinking a little bit too much. He's back inside, and now there's like a, who's going to be the main man. And there were, of course, occasions when the Lions would fight it out inside the confines of many different prison walls as they tried to establish their power as the leader of the pack, which is what was happening. But undoubtedly, Paul Sykes was almost always the daddy of the prison yards.